Well, hello there. I hope everybody enjoyed learning about rockets. And if we have tested our rockets already, then I hope you had a good time and you learned a little bit about Newton's three laws. Of course, Newton's first law, inertia. Second law, force is equivalent to the mass and acceleration. And the third law, action-reaction. Can learn a lot just from a simple idea like those rockets. Anyway, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the history of space exploration. We're going to be doing a great activity with the space race, but I wanted to make sure you all had a little bit of background knowledge about the space race, as well as some of the terminology that we're going to be using when we talk about it. Okay, so what exactly was the space race? No, the United States and not Russia were, running a race to see who could run to the moon faster or anything like that. It was just this rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union in trying to explore space. And again, we're going to go into great detail in an activity in class about that. Russia did launch, or the Soviet Union, excuse me, did launch the first artificial satellite, and that was Sputnik. And if you look at it, just a real rudimentary type of satellite that was able to send back signals. Remember what a satellite is? Just an object that revolves around another object in space. And so, of course, Sputnik was able to orbit Earth. Now, of course, this caused huge issues in the United States because now the Soviet Union had something orbiting above us. Kind of a scary concept. And so, of course, the U.S., hurries up to get involved. And they launched their own satellites. And again, we're going to go into more detail with this when we actually map it out. Of course, we've learned already when we learned about our rockets that Yuri Gagarin was the first human in space. He was Soviet. Alan Shepard was the first American in space. And then came John Glenn, who was the first American to orbit the Earth. And this took place during the time of the Apollo program. And of course, we did watch Apollo 13. A fantastic movie. And of course, this was all put in place because of Kennedy, who said, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before the decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. Of course, that was the more difficult part, returning them safely. But we did have the Apollo program, and it was fantastic because it allowed the United States to explore the moon. And, of course, eventually land a human on the moon, which, of course, the United States are the only ones to have accomplished this. Because of that Apollo program, the astronauts were able to collect samples of moon rocks for analysis so that we could, get a better understanding of what the moon was actually made up of. Scientists then are able to study the structure of the moon by the quakes that occur, by technology that was left there. Aldrin and Armstrong were on the moon for a couple of hours, and they did plant the American flag there. 5 more Apollo missions landed on the moon. And of course, some were able to stay for much longer than just a couple of hours. Unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of benefit, at least seen by the high cost of those moon missions. And so now currently, we typically send up unmanned or unpiloted spacecraft in order to gain that information. Okay, but what people did travel on, unfortunately until recently when it was discontinued, were the space shuttles. And what is a shuttle? It is just obviously a much larger craft that can carry crew into space, return to Earth, and be reused over and over and over again. NASA used the space shuttles to perform tasks like getting satellites into orbit, uh, getting humans up so that they could repair those satellites, going up to the International Space Station. And if you take a look at the structure of the space shuttle, you can see that it has that huge cargo area in order to get materials up and if something needs to be brought back. While on those space shuttles, the astronauts lived in a pressurized cabin. They can wear regular clothes, they breathe oxygen. And remember, we did talk about those things that the space shuttles or suits would have to maintain the temperature and the pressure and have oxygen in order for humans to survive. But of course, there's still no gravity. So that space station in the 70s and 80s, Soviets and the US did place stations in orbit. But in the 90s, the US and other countries started constructing the International Space Station so that they could carry out experiments and work together. Okay, so space probes. There are a lot of different probes up in space doing different things. All a probe does, it's a spacecraft. It carries instruments that can collect data. There is no human crew involved. It is simply launched. And so we have probes all over the place checking out different things and sending that information back. They are fantastic because we can send them there. We can remotely control them. For instance, the Mars rovers that can move around the surface of Mars and send back information as it receives it. And of course, then it can also analyze and do lab type analysis and send that information back so that we can learn more about that specific planet without having to send a person actually there. There is the Lunar Prospector, which found evidence of water, ice, and other things on the moon's surface. It was the New Horizons, which is observing Pluto and will be there in just a couple of years. There is Cassini that explores Saturn, and if you recall, we saw that beautiful hurricane on the north pole of Saturn. That was a picture that was taken by Cassini. And of course, a lot of the bigger ones are exploring Mars right now. Okay, so I hope that gives you a little bit of a better understanding of just some of the terminology that we're going to be discussing when we discuss the space race. And I will talk to you later.